What a fight, first of all, from ringside. Your immediate verdict?
Unbelievable. 116, 112, 3 times. I'm not going to... You've seen me moan before about scores. It is what it is, but... Because it's a waste of time. It's not a 116, 112 fight. He was in the fight. He's coming into the fight as the champion. It's like you get no respect on the scorecards. 116, 112 twice. And you get one judge that wants to score it 116, 112 to Artur Beterbiev. You give Dmitry Bivol 4 rounds in that fight.
The 8-4 scorecard was a bit. Blank's Carl Moretti was...
A bit. 4 rounds to Dmitry Bivol. Come on.
Now, a lot of you guys have been referring to Eddie Hearn as nicknames such as Eggy Hen in the lead up to Chris Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn, which has been hilarious. But my new nickname for him is Eddie, no way was that 116-112, Hearn. And we'll have a quick chat about the scorecards in a bit. But first, let's say, what a night of boxing. That truly lived up to the hype, and then some probably. Because with all the drama in the build-up, a lot of people were probably sceptical of whether the fight could truly live up to it. Because I'm not sure if anyone did call a 12-round war like that. I mean, a few days before the fight, I was pretty much picking the fight to go the distance, but I didn't expect that type of a war. Now, I say a great night of boxing, but the undercard didn't really deliver as much as I thought it would. However, for the main event, the entrance, the theatrics, and the thrilling 12-round back and forth fight we got in the ring, of course made for a great night of boxing. And what a TV moment it was when Eubank Sr. came out of the lift. I had to quickly get a community post up at the time the second I saw Eubank Sr. actually appear, which did get decent engagement by my usual standard of community post. But yeah, say what you want about Eubank Sr. originally boycotting the fight in the build-up and then actually showing up on the night. That was still a great moment there, and all of his boycotting only really promoted the fight further anyway. Now that moment happened during the Aaron McKenna vs Liam Smith fight, I believe between 2 of the middle rounds. And McKenna vs Smith is the one undercard fight that I will touch on in this video. But yeah, that main event, what we got in the ring speaks for itself, don't it? And I'm glad we got such a climax after how much I hyped up the fight. Literally devoted my whole channel to this fight for the last 2 months. Obviously not that that made any difference to the size of the fight at all because of how minute my channel is, but to me, it made a big difference because since that family affairs video I did, from that and all the videos I produced since, my channel literally more than doubled in size in terms of subscribers. And I'm so glad that so many casual fans or even people that are not even really into boxing enjoyed what went down in the ring so much. It is great for the sport. I haven't really been listening to what boxing experts have had to say about the fight and how it played out since it happened, and I'm yet to watch the fight back since watching it live, but I'm just satisfied of how much of a success it was. The entertainment carried throughout. The fight could have been half as good as that and it still would have been a fairly decent comeuppance to all the hype. And I find it weird but pretty cool how so many of the narratives going into the fight either came to fruition or almost came to fruition on the night. It was a very intense start which was fitting to the hatred and history of the rivalry. And in round 3, Conor Benn kinda rocked Chris Eubank Jr. and Eubank Jr.'s eyes went a bit funny. And this looked to be Eubank's weight depletion hurting him, a worry going into the fight. A Benn knockout looked very much on the cards at that point. But in the rounds following, the two men went back and forth swinging at each other at a high output, and Benn never hurt Eubank Jr. that badly again for the rest of the fight really, which satisfied the notion that Conor Benn is too small to hurt Eubank Jr. Now I believed and still believe that Conor Benn is too small to hurt Chris Eubank Jr. But I believe that the shaky moment in the third was down to the fact that Eubank Jr. would have likely got good sparring in for this fight to be able to take a punch well, but this was his first time being hit that hard since draining his body down to the weight to make weight. But after recovering from that shot, it's almost like his body knew how to respond to Benn's punches for the rest of the night. And I'm not here to analyse the fight round for round today, but to skip over to round 12, what an ending to the fight. And fair play to Benn for surviving that onslaught from the bigger man for the last minute plus and still swinging back and fighting his heart out. Neither man would go down to each other. The spirit overtook the body's sensibilities in that fight, and the history and hatred going into the fight fueled them for this great war. And that moment at the end just galvanised that. The way Conor Benn's mouth was open in that final sequence, I thought he was trying to complain about a headbutt or something, but nah, the punches from Eubank caused that reaction from him. And as for the immediate aftermath of the fight, can I say that it's actually perfect that Eubank Sr. showed up and the Benn father and son duo got all emotional and happy that Eubank Sr. turned up, but Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn still refused to touch gloves at the start of the fight and still didn't embrace with each other after the fact. Because after all that nostalgia in the entrances with Conor walking out to Dangerous and Junior walking out to Simply the Best and Eubank Sr. embracing the Benns when he got in the ring, I was afraid that Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. were going to put their hate aside and have a sobby little hug after the fight. but much to my delight, they didn't. They didn't go ahead and ruin all of the genuine hate in the build-up and make all of that look fake. And as for the scorecards, all three judges obviously gave it 116, 112 to Eubank. I personally had it 115, 113 to Eubank, and here's how I had it round for round, which those of you who saw my community post at the time would have seen. And don't go crazy over this because this was just my live scoring, and as I said, I haven't rewatched the fight since, and I was watching to enjoy it. Scoring of course wasn't the priority, but as far as my memory goes, I think round 8 was a swing round, so if you give that one to Eubank then the fight is 116, 112 by my card, so I'm fine with the 116, 112 personally. But yeah, then you've got Eddie, no way was that 116, 112 Hearn going off about that a little bit. It's a bit weird to me why people don't understand how a competitive or even a fairly close fight could be scored 116 to 112. Obviously, that little compilation I showed at the start of the video were from the Crawford vs Madrimov and the Beterbiev vs Bivol 1 fights. And I'll be honest, I actually had Beterbiev Bivol 1 as 116 to 112 for Beterbiev on my live scoring. But to be fair, I didn't score Crawford vs Madrimov when watching that live at the time, and I haven't watched it back in full since. But now, I wouldn't call this Benn vs Eubank Jr. fight a particularly close fight, because the 7 rounds that I gave to Eubank were clear Eubank rounds as far as my memory goes. But the thing is, the way Eddie puts it into perspective, 8 rounds to 4, you know, how could you have that guy winning by 4 rounds, or how can you only give my guy 4 out of the 12 rounds? It makes it sound so bad. But you know the saying, a fight could go either way, yeah? Considering that even rounds are shunned upon in boxing for the most part, that basically means 7 rounds to 5 either way. But typically, a close fight will have multiple swing rounds. So if a fight is full of close rounds, you can win a fight 8-4 having only edged a few of the 8 rounds that you won. And again, this isn't even the case here, because even though I gave Eubank Jr. 7 of the rounds as opposed to 8, I didn't just edge them to him. But yeah, just on the general topic of 8-4 fights, the fight is scored on a round for round basis. So even if the fight as a whole looked close, as a judge, if there's a very close round that you edge to Crawford, let's say, and the next round is also very close, but you also saw Crawford just slightly nick that one by a hair as well, you don't then just give that round to Madrimov to even things out on the whole because he's boxed well for both rounds and you want to give him credit for it. If someone nicks a particular round by your viewing, then he nicks that round. A close and competitive fight can be 116 to 112. I understand complaints about a 117, 111 of course, but hearing Eddie Hearn say, 116, 112, right after a fight has just become funny to me at this point. And more in the aftermath. There was a lot of emotion from both men. Benn looked absolutely dishevelled, and Eubank looked absolutely elated. It was scenes to be fair. I posted a picture of Eubank roaring in celebration on my community post at the time, and that was the most likes that little O.M.E boxing has ever got on a community post by far. We can see what it meant to Eubank with everything he's been through, you know, all of that family stuff that has been very much publicised and that I've discussed at length in my series in preview of this fight. And in his post-fight interview, he said that there's a lot that's been going on in the lead up to this fight that he's not going to get into. So perhaps he's going through even more that we don't know about. I don't know what that could be. There was someone that was in attendance for his last fight that wasn't in attendance for this one, but yeah, I don't know. And as for both men's face after the fight, that proved the dangers of this fight weight-wise for both men. A major concern that was at the forefront of the whole build-up basically going into the fight. Of course, it wasn't all-out war with many punches landed, but both men looked abnormally disfigured. Eubank's face was swollen and he got cut quite early in the fight. This is because the skin is more prone to damage when you drain and dehydrate yourself to lose weight. And Conor Benn looked like something out of a horror movie as a result of absorbing punishment from the much bigger man over 12. And as for Eubank being sent off to the hospital right after, that was a bit of a scare initially, as those of you who watched my series in preview of this fight, especially the end bit of that long family affairs video, you know that the writing was almost on the wall for something to go horribly wrong for Eubank Jr. health-wise from that fight. But luckily, he just went to the hospital for checkups. Another narrative going into the fight that sort of took a turn for the better on the night for Eubank Jr. was the narrative that it was Eubank Jr. versus everyone, the line in my thumbnail for my final pre-fight video. I contrasted and compared how Conor Benn had his dad by his side, unlike Eubank Jr. And his whole family to be fair, you know, he had his siblings there and everything. Yeah. I obviously also went through the Chris Eubank Jr. versus Matchroom boxing as a whole sort of thing, And then the other little things like Billy Joe Saunders being there to check Junior's reps. But Eubank Junior's father of course did show up at the night after all. He made that big emphatic entrance and he was by his son's side. And not as big of a story, but still a big story. As for the Billy Joe Saunders thing, best believe he would not go into Eubank Jr.'s locker room before the fight to check his reps and antagonise him like Conor Benn wanted, because Eubank Jr.'s manager Napa was just not having that at all. And most importantly, Eubank Jr. got a fair shake on the scorecards, which we didn't really expect after all that shenanigans with the official weigh-in. We thought that Eddie Hearn had absolutely everything rigged against Eubank Jr. after that debacle, so Eddie might have had the scales rigged, but it's a good thing that he didn't have the judges in his pocket and all. But of course, this Eubank Jr. versus Matchroom Boxing thing still stands because Eddie Hearn is already talking about bringing Eubank Jr. down to a catchweight if a rematch happens. And now, remember in my pre-fight video how I was contrasting Conor and Nigel's great relationship to Eubank Sr. and Jr.'s soured relationship? Well, there was a bit of static between Conor and Nigel Benn as a result of Conor's loss.
What he done in training he didn't actually do. But I'm not going to knock him for that, you know. He'll go home and watch the fight and see where he went wrong. Come back.
Did you say you're not going to knock me for that while you're knocking me?
Well, you know, you gave it to me, mate. You said Dad couldn't do the business, but I'll have to come and do it.
Fair.
Right,
fair.
but
Bit tense there, innit? That's because Conor Benn was saying things in the build-up about having to settle the Eubank versus Benn score because his dad couldn't.
Dad, why have you left your dirty laundry to me, mate? Why have I got to close the show for you? Why have I got to handle your dirty business? You know, I've got to do this for my dad. You know, because he couldn't do it himself.
And he definitely said something along those lines a total of about 3 or 4 times in the build-up to this fight, but I'm not asked to find the other instances of him saying this sort of thing. I know it's light-hearted, but there definitely is a good bit of tension there, I'd say. And in the build-up to the fight, I've seen people comment on certain pre-fight content, not my own content, just like Matchroom blogs and all this stuff, saying that they're slightly discomforted with the disrespect that Conor shows towards Nigel sometimes. And as light-hearted as it may seem to other people, I do think that this press conference moment brought to light some existing tension. So yeah, funny turn of events there after the Eubank victory, because pre-fight, everyone was mainly going on about Eubank Sr.'s public disapproval of his boy, and people were highly critical of that. But it went the other way round after the Eubank stood victorious, with the tension between the Benn father and son duo. So elsewhere in the night, we saw Aaron McKenna get the win over Liam Smith in what was the performance of the night and my favourite fight on the undercard. 2 fights before the big main event that was. I actually scored that fight a shutout for Aaron McKenna. Well, he was deducted a point for excessive forearm use in the 6th, but with the knockdown he scored in the 12th. That's a 119 to 107 card for me. Say what you want about Liam Smith and his age, but that performance was almost punch perfect from the Irishman. He teed off on Liam Smith with lovely combos when he stepped into range, and then got out of range at the right time on each occasion to use his range advantage to full effect, and pretty much boxed Liam Smith around. He displayed great footwork in there, switching stance, he was tricky, threw great uppercuts to exploit Liam Smith's infamous high guard, and he went to the body very well too in order to exploit that high guard, throwing a couple upstairs, then digging down to the body, which of course paid off with a peach of a left hook to the body that put Smith down in the 12th. You could say it was an uninspiring performance from Smith, but McKenna didn't give Smith a chance to get to work for the most part, and Smith did try to turn things up in the second half of the fight, to no avail of course. And I'd like to call this a great outside fighting performance from Aaron McKenna, but he did get stuck in there to swat and throw 4+ punch combinations at times and wasn't afraid to meet Liam Smith in the middle when he needed to. And I'm going to go ahead and say that Aaron McKenna was the real winner of the whole card, including the main event. Of course we had a great main event between 2 guys that would have made a lot more money than him, but McKenna proved himself in a huge way on the best stage possible. Eubank Jr. was the big winner in that climactic main event, but he'd been knocked out by the guy that McKenna was fighting on the undercard in Liam Smith, and McKenna absolutely dominated and shut out Liam Smith, almost proving himself to be a class above the main event participants, because it's fair to say that McKenna got a healthier version of Liam Smith than Eubank Jr. did in the rematch. And remember, a lot of experts were picking Smith to beat McKenna, but he shut them all up and left no doubts about his ability in the ring. But to be fair, this wasn't actually an upset because McKenna was the favourite on the odds, and he was the younger and undefeated fighter with a decent resume. For instance, he previously beat Wisma Lima by a pretty wide gap on the cards, and Lima has since become an IBO world champion. But yeah, I look forward to Aaron McKenna's next fight after that performance, and I'll certainly be betting on him next time around, believe you me. He has a bright future ahead for sure. I love the defensive responsibility on display from Aaron against Liam Smith as well. That differentiates a lot from his older brother Stephen McKenna, who's an exciting fighter that we all love to watch. But boy is Stephen stressful to watch if you're rooting for him and you have money on him. A lot of holes in his game, that Stephen. Dropped twice and defeated against Lee Cutler last time out. And since then, Cutler lost to Sam Eggington on that Whittaker Cameron 2 undercard the other week, so the loss aged badly for Stephen McKenna as well. I definitely don't want to use Aaron McKenna's success on the weekend to slag off his brother at all. I do hope Stephen can bounce back from that loss, and to be totally frank, it is good to see that Aaron doesn't have the same holes in his game that his older brother Stephen has displayed. But yeah, the future is bright for Aaron McKenna in this middleweight division, and Aaron is promoted by Mick Hennessy, so that's all the more reason to like him. And Hennessy said after the fight that Aaron McKenna is the best at middleweight, and he's very confident that his man McKenna will become undisputed middleweight champion of the world, which we love to hear. And on the topic of being promoted by Mick Hennessy, I'll go as far to say that Aaron McKenna's performance against Liam Smith was shades of Ali. I know after how much I hyped up everything surrounding Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr., it would have been cool to do an immediate post-fight reaction at the time, but to keep it a million, I tuned into the UFC fight night from the start of the prelims shortly after the Eubank vs Benn broadcast finished. Not the early prelims, of course, because that would have been on at the same time as Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr., I think, so just the prelims. I'm obviously not going to talk about the whole card, for I am not an MMA YouTuber, but on the topic of Aaron McKenna's win earlier in the night, Saturday night was a great night of combat sport for the Irish, because Ian Garry certainly did impress in that main event victory over Carlos Prates, or shall I say, Carlos Prates. Nothing less than I expected, because Garry was the favourite just like Aaron McKenna was, but unlike McKenna, I did actually bet on Ian Garry to win. But much like McKenna again, a lot of people were picking Garry to lose to Prates, a lot of the experts. The hype around them fighting nerds and the doubt around Ian Garry is abhorrent, to be honest. But just like Aaron McKenna, Garry put on a masterclass for a decision win and shut everyone up. Well, I'd say it was a masterclass from Garry for the most part of 4 rounds. Superb kickboxing performance, absolutely schooled a guy on the feet who was meant to be so dangerous, and he proved his vast superiority in the striking department. After Garry's last 2 performances, holding it down with Shavkat on the ground and in the clinch, and grapple grape in MVP, we would have expected a grapple heavy approach against Prates here, but Garry proved to be an all-round great fighter again. Prates did show great takedown defense throughout the fight though. I think I recall him stuffing all of the takedowns with relative ease in the first 3 rounds. Not that Garry needed the takedowns at that point, and Garry did have some success with the takedown in the 4th, but Prates kinda actually started holding it down on the feet in the 4th after getting back up. And now, I made all of those comparisons to Aaron McKenna, a masterclass from the Irishman who everyone picked against, but at the end of the 5th, it was more shades of Conor Benn earlier in the night from Ian Garry, showing great heart and wherewithal to survive the onslaught after being rocked with over a minute to go in the final round. But unlike Benn, Garry won by a clear unanimous decision on the cards. 149-46 card, as he obviously lost the 5th round, and the 2 48-47s from judges who probably just edged the 4th to Prates. That was the round that Prates reopened the cut that Garry already had going into the fight, wherever that came from. Garry's dominance in that fight wasn't from Prates' lack of cardio like everyone says. People just have to accept that Garry outclassed Prates. Low output doesn't just come from a lack of cardio. Garry was beating him to every punch and to every kick, leg, head and body, which probably made Prates tentative to throw. And Prates was also on point enough to stuff a dozen odd takedowns in the first 3 rounds? You know, I'll make a loose comparison to Prates' performance in this fight to Alex Pereira's performance against Magomed Ankalaev in that he really wasn't letting his hands go that much, but he was getting outfoxed on the feet by the guy who's supposed to be the superior grappler, but he did show great takedown defense. But I make that comparison to say, I don't really remember anyone saying that Alex Pereira's poor performance in that fight was due to a lack of cardio, so, you know, all these people, they pick Prates to win so hard, and then when Garry dominates him, you know, they turn around and start grilling Prates for his lack of cardio. And by the way, I love Ian Garry's self-hype and confidence in his interviews and all the press conferences. He really sells himself well. And all of that self-hype has solidified him as the backup for the title fight between Belal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena in Quebec. Of course, along with the fact that Garry has been a consummate pro and took his last 2 fights on short notice against absolute killers in the division. And I really like Jack Della Maddalena, but I think Ian Garry is the man to beat Belal Muhammad. And I don't give Jack Della Maddalena much of a chance against Bilal, I hate to say. He probably just gets completely out-wrestled. And how mad would it be if Garry stepped in on short notice if JDM had to pull out, and Garry stepped in right at the last minute, just 2 weeks after fighting Prates, to beat Bilal Muhammad for the belt. But obviously that is very unlikely. And with Sean Bradley, Joaquin Buckley and Shavkat, who's due to come back from injury soon, it's most likely that Garry is not even the next one in line after JDM. He might not even be one of the next 2 in line. As much as I'd love to go on about Ian Garry and the UFC welterweight division right now, I'll hold myself back as the main focus here is boxing. But one more thing I have to address. I know Garry has displayed a lack of finishing ability, and as much as I would love to see him get the finish, meritocracy wise, you can't discredit a man who wins that comprehensively against top competition, whether or not they get the finish. But trust me, I would have rather he did get the finish. As a degenerate gambler, I had Ian Garry just to win as a lock anyway, before I even placed any other bet that night. But after spreading a bunch of change on various fights from the boxing and on the UFC undercard, all of which lost, by the point of the Garry fight, I was in a position where a Garry win would have reimbursed me nicely, but I would have still been at a slight loss. So instead of throwing a decent stake in to double down on Garry just to win, like a little fanny, I took a punt and put a low stake on him to get the stoppage, which would have actually put me in profit. But of course, he didn't get the stoppage, so I was still at a loss at that point, despite his win giving me a pretty decent return. So trust me, if anyone wanted Ian Garry to get the stoppage, it was me. But I'm not one to let my gambling dictate my take on a fight. I mean, I actually had a bit of change on Conor Benn to win on points, and I was buzzing when Eubank got the win. I only really throw change on fights for the fun of it, and I always have the necessary steps in play to up the stakes and break even on football on the Sunday, however many bets that may take. And it only took one this weekend just gone, as my next bet was Man United double chance at the 2 PM kickoff. So as pathetic as I was to be celebrating a late equaliser against a 10-man Bournemouth in a game that meant nothing to us, it broke me even for my boxing and MMA woes as per usual. But as a United fan, let's not even talk about what happened for the rest of that day in football. But nah, it's time to get back to boxing anyway, my bad. So as for what's coming up in boxing, we've got a big weekend ahead with the triple header in the Times Square card on Friday. Then on Saturday you've got the Canelo vs Skull fights with a big undercard. You know, you've got Munguia vs Arasi 2-1 there, Bacoli vs Jagbar, and you've got the Cruiserweight title fight. And then on Sunday you've got Naoya Inoue fighting. So pound for pound styles all over this 3-day period of boxing. As for the triple header, as much as I'm not going to complain about the order of the card as I understand business, as far as I see it, Teofimo Lopez vs Arnold Barboza is the real main event, as opposed to Devin Haney vs Jose Ramirez above it, and Ryan Garcia vs Rolly Romero as the actual main event above that. As disrespectful as it may seem to Rolly Romero and former unified world champion Jose Ramirez, we can tell by how this card is being promoted that it's just to hype up a potential rematch between Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney. And to be honest, I do think that Ryan Garcia knocks Rolly out, and I do think that Haney jabs Ramirez's head in. And once Garcia vs Haney 2 is made official, I might even do a series in preview of that fight, shades of the Benn vs Eubank series I've just done. And yeah, as for those 2 non-title fights being above the WBO and Ring Super Lightweight title fight in Teofimo Lopez vs Arnold Barboza, it's obviously because Garcia and Haney are each bigger stars than Teofimo Lopez and Arnold Barboza combined, to be quite frank. And so is Rolly Romero, to be honest. But of course, despite there being 3 other world champions in the super lightweight division other than Teofimo Lopez, and despite this fight then of course not being a unification fight, just a fight against the WBO interim champion Barboza, to me, this Teofimo Lopez vs Arnold Barboza fight is the biggest fight in the super lightweight division right now, especially with Barboza's recent win over Jack Catterall in February. An upset win which I did react to on my channel, so I'll link that in the description down below. And I'm going to let you guys know why I think Barboza will beat Teofimo Lopez and why I want him to, even though I'm not the biggest Arnold Barboza fan. Look, I know this is what a closeted hater would say, but I'm no Teofimo Lopez hater. I'm not one of these people who's discomforted by the way he's been acting. I'm not in my feelings about some of the stuff he said in recent times. I'm not rooting for the humble guy against the guy who brings the bravado, as Teo has actually successfully reduced Barboza to his bravado. And of course, Teofimo Lopez is a great fighter who holds massive wins over Vasyl Lomachenko and Josh Taylor. And Barboza was actually on the undercard of Teo vs Loma, by the way. And I give Lopez credit for taking this Barboza fight, because as I said in my video reacting to Barboza vs Catterall, I actually thought Teofimo was going to vacate the WBO strap to duck Barboza. But here's the thing, maybe I'm just a dirty rotten casual, but from a boxing standpoint, It doesn't really sit right with me that people hold Teofimo Lopez to as high a regard as they do, and they talk as if he's the best of the bunch in this era of big stars in and around his weight class, but then they excuse him for his loss against Barboza, a fight which he lost all his lightweight titles in, and they excuse him for his questionable and lackluster wins over the likes of Sandor Martin and Jermaine Ortiz. They excuse him by saying, oh, he struggles with these tricky and awkward opponents and he's not motivated to fight these smaller names or whatever, but if he gets in there with any of the big names, he'll show up and put on a great performance. So we're supposed to believe that Teofimo Lopez is secretly the best and most skilled of them all, but he's underperforming in all of these fights, and fighting the likes of Steve Claggett when there's all of these big fights to be made. I don't care how good he looks at his best, I just can't see him as an all-round great fighter. But again, maybe that's just because I'm a casual and I don't know what I'm looking at. Call that hate if you want, but there's no taking away from him that he's a two-weight lineal champ with them two massive wins over Lomachenko and Taylor. But how can I sit here and buy into all these nonsensical narratives that Teofimo just automatically beats all of the top guys in the world, like your Devin Haney's, your Ryan Garcia's, the other champs at 140 and all of that? And guess what? Arnold Barboza is one of them tricky and awkward guys, and he ain't really one of these massive names to motivate Teofimo Lopez for a worldly performance. Now, I actually picked Jack Catterall to beat Arnold Barboza before their fight in February, and that was a fight between two tricky customers, both coming off of big wins of their own, Barboza over Jose Ramirez and Catterall over Regis Prograis. But Catterall was quite a marginal favourite on the odds, so he was touted to get the better of that projected technical affair. And it was a technical affair indeed. But Barboza ultimately got the win. I know it was a split decision on the cards, but I personally gave it Barboza 116 to 112, and I gave him every round in the second half of the fight. Despite me being engrossed in the fight while watching it live, considering how high a regard I hold both men in meritocracy wise, what was at stake, how lively the crowd was, and the fact that I was scoring the fight knowing that it was going to go the distance and I was going to give an immediate reaction. To be honest, that fight was objectively boring, and despite Barboza being the clear winner, he didn't have to land that many punches to outpoint Catterall. Both men were cagey, and despite Barboza being the aggressor, when he pushed forward he would only engage very briefly to avoid a counterpunch from Catterall. So in turn, you had the two men fighting for position to get off of one punch pretty much. So Barboza got a convincing win on the cards by merely landing some rights to the body here and there, and these 1-2-1s that he threw going forward that only the jab on the end of would land as Catterall would back straight up. So Arnold Barboza practically beat the technical and fairly boring Jack Catterall at his own game. So best believe Barboza could make Teofimo Lopez look how Sandor Martin and Jermaine Ortiz made him look, but probably worse, and worse enough to get a win over Teo. So I am excited for this Times Square card, especially Teofimo Lopez versus Arnold Barboza. But as weird as this may sound, I actually want Arnold Barboza to stink the place out and nullify Teo to become the new WBO and Ring Magazine champ at 140. Because if Teo gets made to look average yet again, what are people going to say then? That's really just going to prove that he doesn't do enough in there. I also do predict this to happen, but not wholeheartedly. Teo may show up his best for Barboza, but if he does, and he wins in style, I'm just afraid that he's going to have a lackluster performance in his next one, and then we'll see the cycle continue. Oh, and by the way, what makes it so diabolical that Teo is neither the main event nor the co-main event on Friday is not because he's the only world champ on the card. It's because this fight is in his home state of New York. But all of the other 5 guys on the big 3 fights on the card, so of course the 4 guys fighting above him as well as his opponent, are all from the West Coast. So that's got to be rough for Teo, not main eventing in his hometown and giving up that spot to these chaps from the other side of the country. But yeah man, I don't hate Teo, and I'd love it for him if he went on a crazy consistent run of big wins, but I just don't really like this up and down stuff man, I'll be real. And as for other fights coming up, we've got Kakachi vs Wood on May 10th, which I do look to do a pre-fight video on. That should be my very next video. And we've also got the announcement of Usyk vs Dubois too. Now not to be that guy to try and dampen the hype around it, but I've already given my opinion on the potential of this rematch being made before it was actually official. And now it is official, my opinion still hasn't changed one bit. So you see the video on screen, I'll link that in the top of the description. And I know it's a long video, but skip on over to the who is most deserving to get a shot at Usyk timestamp, and in that timestamp I pretty much explain why Dubois shouldn't be next in line for Usyk in about 8 minutes. But I'll say now, I very much pick Usyk to beat Dubois again. Now the only pre-fight content I consider doing for that fight is the which Brit performed the best against Alexander Usyk video. A video that I've been planning on doing for a good while now. and I will do that video anyway, but I say considering because I might actually produce that video after Usyk vs Dubois 2, so I can actually include the Dubois rematch in there as well, and that video will then be relevant forever. But yeah, so much going on in boxing this week, you know, all the hype around the 3 fights on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You've got a lot of controversy going on with that Usyk Dubois stuff that I haven't really been keeping up with at all. You've got other rumoured fights going on that, again, I'm not too fussed to get into right now. So for me now personally, not to try and be a contrarian, but all I really care about is Teofimo Lopez vs Arnold Barboza. And chronologically, it is the very next fight, because obviously it's on the Friday card and it's the first of the triple header. So yeah, after that fight concludes, I'll start looking ahead to all the other stuff in boxing, but that's actually the only thing I'm really focused on right now. Oh, and actually there is some important news that did come out this week that I will mention in case any of you didn't know. Jarrell Miller is pulling out of his fight against Fabio Wardley on June 7th. The card's still on for Ipswich. They've still got Portman Road booked, but yeah, Wardley's going to be fighting someone else. So after all that hype from Miller, that fight's now cancelled because of Miller. Injury, drug test, issues with money, who knows, but the fight's off at the end of the day. But as for the fights this weekend, the reason why I care about Lopez vs Barboza the most is because you look to all the other big fights. You look to Canelo vs Skull, you know, the fights beneath that, Ajagba vs Bokoli, Sarase vs Munguia 2. You look to the Inoue fight, and you look to the 2 fights above Lopez vs Barboza in Rolly Romero vs Ryan Garcia and Jose Ramirez vs Devin Haney. Now, I know odds don't mean everything, but the odds don't lie, and they're a good indicator of how competitive fights are. You know, go check the odds for all those fights and look how wide the odds are. Barboza vs Teofimo Lopez is the livest matchup by far. I mean, Barboza is quite the underdog, but he's a live dog, and he's nowhere near as big of an underdog as all the other underdogs on the weekend in those big fights. Well, to be fair, the cruiserweight title fight between Badu Jack and Mikhailian on the Canelo vs Skull undercard, that is closer on the odds, but that fight, I mean, what is going on with the WBC cruiserweight title? And this is a fight between 2 guys who have been so inactive, so that fight's 3 fights below the main event for a reason. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is Lopez vs Barboza, that's the main event this week. Alright, so apologies if this wasn't the satisfactory reaction video to the Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. fight that I put so much time into producing pre-fight content for. But to be totally honest, there's not much else to say. The build-up was immense, the fight was magical, and we ought to just leave it there. I'm not fussed to ponder about it and keep up with the post-fight fallout for several weeks. Apart from the 116, 112 stuff maybe.
When they've gone 116, 112, I'm sitting there going, 116, 112. 116, 112. 116, 112. Unanimous. Unanimous.
But yeah, it is time to move on with the amount of other things that are going on in boxing right now. And speaking of moving on, in regards to potential rematch between Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr., this seems to be something that everyone has a very strong opinion on. But me personally, I'm actually very indifferent on the matter. I'm just going to focus on what's actually happening in boxing next, and if the rematch does get made, then I will actually get back to the Eubank Benn content, as I said in my final pre-fight video. And I do want to thank everyone who showed love to my Eubank Benn content. I know that I'm still just a small channel, but again, that series really did give me a good few new supporters, and I'm glad that some of you guys liked the concept of that whole series. It was a calculated move to do the series, so I'm not shocked that it more than doubled my subscriber count, but I do still want to show appreciation to all the people who engaged with it and helped it to gain traction. Now, my schedule in the very near future is rather shaky. Well, it should have been shaky the whole time, but let's say I've made some risky compromises to focus on making these Benn vs Eubank videos. That's by my own choice, of course. I'm not just a sportsbook gambler, I also gamble with my livelihood. And I will reveal the ill-advised compromise I'm making to prioritise creating YouTube boxing content in the near future, when this other commitment in my life comes to a conclusion, let's say, and likely a premature conclusion at this rate. But I will still look to produce this Kakachi vs Wood pre-fight video that I've been planning on doing since that fight was announced back in like February, so stay tuned for that one. I do hope to get it up at least 2 or 3 days before the fight actually happens. Of course, comment your thoughts down below about Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. And you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.